Why should the juvenile courts be abolished?
To get started, I think it's important for us to know what juvenile courts are and what it is that they do. Each state has a special set of courts, usually called juvenile courts, to deal with minors who have been accused of violating a criminal statute. The proceedings are civil as opposed to criminal, so instead of being formally charged with a crime, juvenile offenders are accused of committing a delinquent act. A juvenile case normally gets started when the prosecutor or probation officer files a civil petition charging the juvenile with violating a criminal statute and asking that the court determine that the juvenile is delinquent. If the charges are proved and the delinquency determination is made, the juvenile offender comes under the court's broad powers. At that point, the juvenile court has the authority to do what it considers to be in the best interest of the juvenile. Often, the juvenile court retains legal authority over the minor for a set period of time, until the juvenile becomes an adult, or sometimes even longer.
Now we will take a look at the history of the juvenile courts. Until the 19th century, courts included trials for both kids and adults. The educational reform movement in England saw youth differently from adults because they were not fully developed in moral or cognitive capacities. This led to the juvenile justice reform here in the U.S. The first juvenile court was established in 1899 in Cook County, Illinois, and continued to spread across the country from there. In the 1950s and 1960s, the public became very concerned with the effectiveness of the juvenile court system because of the wide variety of sentencing judges were assigning based off of the judge's discretions at that time. In the 1960s, the Supreme Court made many changes to formalize the juvenile court system to give everyone a concrete basis on how to punish and treat juveniles. In the 1980s, the public thought that the rulings given to juveniles were too lenient. This resulted in many states passing laws that included mandatory sentencing and automatic transfers to adult court for specific crimes. In the 1990s, states started to decline in incarceration rates for juveniles. Today, many states such as California, Hawaii, and Massachusetts are beginning to make major reforms to the juvenile justice system. So why should we abolish juvenile justice courts? In our book, it gives us a lot of examples of why we should abolish these courts, and 3 of them will be talked about now. First, the child does not receive the same protection and procedural rights given to adults on trial. These rights include the right to a jury trial, the right to a public trial, and the right to bail. Juveniles can also refuse their right to an attorney, but research shows that they do not have the mental capacity or understanding to defend themselves like adults do. Second, juveniles do not receive the regenerative treatment that the court was designed to give to the kids. Juvenile courts in reality are focused on crime control rather than assessing their real needs, and in the book, it describes real needs as social welfare, family assistance, help, housing, nutrition, education, segregation issues, and poverty. Finally, juveniles who are transferred to adult criminal courts may receive substantially longer sentences. This takes place because the overall sentence takes into account the child's previous delinquency sentencing from the juvenile courts as well as the current adult criminal court sentences that are decided by a jury trial. Some of the pros of the juvenile courts is first, it brings justice for extreme crimes. While juveniles may be minors, it doesn't matter the age of the offender. If you're a threat to society, then you're a threat to society. Victims and the families of the victims still deserve a sense of justice, even if one of their members is affected or even killed by a juvenile offender. Second, courts focus on age instead of crime. Someone who is 11 years old should not be imprisoned with adults. Mature mental ability begins much later in life. 3, the majority of states consider children to be adults at the age of 18. So this is a very high number because teenagers do not have the full control over their thoughts and actions as would an adult. So if they do not have the moral compass instilled in them by that time, then they are very likely to continue to commit more heinous crimes. And fourth, juvenile crime is on the rise. In the past few years, we have received record numbers of crimes being committed by juvenile offenders. This is a scary fact because it shows how the boundaries are becoming more and more blurred for these young people. Many of them are aware of just how flawed the juvenile justice system is, so they use that to their advantage. Some of the cons of the juvenile courts are, first, it poses as a risk for juveniles to be transferred into adult courts, which could result in them becoming sentenced to adult prisons. Juveniles are still in adolescence and their brain is still developing to the point that something bad could happen in prisons with adults. They could possibly be taken advantage of, or they could also be trained as kind of criminals in training, I guess. Or they could join gangs and things like that. So it could be a serious risk for these kids if they were transferred into adult prisons. Second, parental rights are stripped. The parents are stripped of their parental rights and the state becomes the kids' legal guardians. And this could cause a lot of disruption and chaos in the child's life. Third, it could provoke child offenders. Some kids who will not have a good reaction against strict punishment and rigid rules, they can easily become more aggressive and more violent, and they may pick up even worse behavior with adults in prisons that could result in even more destructive behavior. Four, there's lifetime effects on these kids who are tried in juvenile courts. A child with a criminal record will always live with the label of being a delinquent. This gives them a hard time to try to change their reputation and reintegrate into society and living normal lives. And finally, there's no access to a jury trial. The children are not allowed access to a jury trial. The judges are the ones who make the final decisions. And if more people were involved, maybe they would receive less punishment or things like that. But in this case, it's just a judge, and the judge is open to his discretion. In conclusion, although juveniles may commit a crime not knowing what their consequences will be later in life, this does not excuse them from their actions. Justice needs to be given to those who are affected, and juveniles should be referred to the appropriate placement to derail them from the path they are choosing to take. Though there are risks to abolishing juvenile courts, there are also risks that come with keeping the courts. Abolishing the juvenile courts brings greater safety to the juvenile and their family and their communities they live in. Although they are being tried as adults, this does not necessarily mean that they would be sitting in prison cells with adults. That doesn't mean that they could possibly, that the possibility should be overlooked. As mentioned, juveniles are not cognitively mature enough, affecting the choices they choose to make, and when in the court system, disabling them from protecting themselves in trials. Allowing juveniles to be tried as adults will allow them the opportunity to receive the advocating that they need, along with referrals to agencies that will allow them to change their patterns of behavior prior to continuing their criminal records. We hope you enjoyed our presentation, and here are our sites that we visited for all of our information. Thank you.